Hi, and welcome again to Leo's Lessons. I've got an interesting one for you today on how capitalism survived in the United States during the 1930s. I'll start by saying that the theme of this is going to be on government and how government tends to be the problem and tends to create a lot of crises. And then with each subsequent crises, they become larger and more powerful because they attempt to fix the problem they created. And so in my career, I've seen this happen now twice, probably a lot more, but two big significant events since I've started this business. The financial crisis in 2007 through 2009. Government came in and said to Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, the primary 80% of mortgages originated through them. They said, hey, you've got to make loans to subprime borrowers because housing prices will go up forever and they need to be homeowners just like everyone else. They don't need to put 20% down. Some of you may remember ninja loans, no income, no job. And so those things luckily are gone. But the government created that problem, that housing crisis, which led to a recession. And then more recently, the coronavirus pandemic, which government said initially, hey, we need 15 days to flatten the curve. And that 15 days turned into 2 years. And what happened in those 2 years? Government attempted to make sure that since they were forcing us to stay home, well, they wanted to make sure we ate. So they printed a lot of money and increased the monetary supply by 40%. And here we are now dealing with inflation and $5 to $6 to $7 to eventually $8 gas prices. So that's kind of doom and gloom. I'm sorry, but let's start with a little happier topic. I'm a Stephen King fan. And what led me to make this presentation today, got the idea from actually watching a Stephen King movie. And it's another 80s remake because Hollywood apparently has no new ideas. So they remade Firestarter, which was, I think, a 1984 Drew Barrymore movie. And I was ready to be disappointed, but I watched it and it was actually really good. But the plot of the movie is this. Government runs clinical trials that go wrong. And as a result of the clinical trials going wrong, the government has to create an agency to fix the problem. Well, one of the products of their experiment destroys all of the government officials, the government building that created the problem to begin with. So if it were only that easy. So the fiction piece is applicable to the theme of today's presentation. Once again, government creates the problem and then they try to fix the problem. All right, so where does this go from here? It was a fascinating case that I learned about, ALA, Schechter Brothers versus the United States, and it starts in the Great Depression. This is mid-1929, and the Great Depression starts in the United States. Total output is measured by GDP falls by a full 1/3. Unemployment rises to 25%. The depression spreads to other parts of the world. It brings lower output, higher unemployment, hunger and desperation. That hunger and desperation leads to a lot of problems. And in Germany in particular, it led to the rise of Adolf Hitler, and Adolf Hitler led to World War II. In China, it brought communists to power. And in the United States, it brought us socialism and very close, if it were not for the Schechter brothers, very close to communism. The propaganda at the time persuaded the public that capitalism was an unstable system destined to suffer more serious crises, which led to the belief that government had to play a more active role in the economy. This was a big change in the public's perception coming from the Roaring 20s in what the proper role of the private enterprise on the one hand and the government on the other paved the way for the rapid growth of the centrally planned government in business. So it's understood now what were the implications of the Great Depression, what caused it, what exacerbated it, but not back then. The Great Depression was indeed a monetary collapse. It was both a cause and an effect of the economic collapse. It originated in the Federal Reserve policies, and it made the economic collapse, which would have been a run-of-the-mill recession, don't know that for sure, but it was made far worse than it otherwise would have been if it were not for the Federal Reserve policies. And I will discuss the Great Depression at length in another segment. So as is usually the case, the government tried to solve the very problem it had created by expanding in size and infringing on our constitutional rights. As is typical then and is now, the government blamed all the problems on external influences beyond its control, and then it takes credit for any and all favorable outcomes. Meanwhile, it promotes the myth that the private economy is unstable. It's easy to document, however, that government is always the source of economic instability. Maybe in hindsight, more easy than when you're going through it. But aside from the Civil War, the Great Depression was the greatest crisis in American history. The U.S. and capitalism appeared to be falling apart. FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, in his administration's attempt to combat the problems of poverty, unemployment, and the disintegration of our economy, felt that he could enact extraordinary, innovative policies. And this was called the New Deal. He had folks in his administration that had traveled to the Soviet Union and wanted to apply some of the ideas of communism in an attempt to save us from the Great Depression in the United States. And this is where the ideas came from. So it did flirt with Marxism and the notion that the model for a more humane society could be found in the Soviet Union. So as part of the New Deal, guess what? Congress created agencies and laws and codes. And so one of them was the National Industrial Recovery Act, NIRA for short, and to be administered by a new agency called the National Regulatory Administration. So they crafted the codes and many regulations that applied to just about any business you can think of, from restaurants to industrial companies to poultry shops, which is how the Schechter brothers get involved. So one of the many, many, many regulatory codes for businesses to deal with was the Live Poultry Code. And this was in Section 3 of the NIRA, which gave the president authority to approve such codes of unfair competition. You see, the FDR administration thought that if businesses competed too much, prices for products and services would be too low. That's what competition does. And as a result, incomes and salaries would be also too low. So he wanted to get rid of unfair or too much competition. Schechter brothers were Joseph, Martin, Alex, and Aaron, and they ran kosher butcher shops in Brooklyn, New York. And they followed the Jewish laws of kashrut. Kashrut laws required that animals be treated humanely and also placed high standards on sanitation and health. The key thing is that it allowed customers to inspect their own chickens before purchasing them for tuberculosis, and if they just like the bird or not. So that was a violation of the NIRA codes. So the NRA specified that no customer could choose or refuse an individual bird. This meant that by law, customers were not allowed to check the chicken's lungs. The Schechter brothers' own internal inspection process, which is one of the many reasons that people in the neighborhood and people in the state came and bought birds from the Schechter brothers, was now illegal. Schechter brothers then underwent numerous and burdensome inspections, and they had to follow the kosher laws of kashrut. And eventually, the NRA took them to court, where they won for violating these multiple violations of the codes. And as a result, they were sent to prison. Well, the Schechter brothers felt that the government had stepped outside its constitutional boundaries. They hired an attorney, and through perseverance, they appealed to the circuit court, where they lost. But then they appealed, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court. And that was in 1935. The court's 9 justices handed down a unanimous ruling in favor of the Schechter brothers. They reasoned that Congress had gone too far in delegating its lawmaking power to the president. They said the president cannot be allowed to have unbridled control to make whatever laws he believes to be necessary to achieve a certain goal. It was a lengthy opinion, and the court demonstrated a complete unwillingness to endorse Roosevelt's argument that the national crisis of the economic depression demanded radical innovation. Thanks to the Schechter brothers and their perseverance, the NRA ended. That agency was gone. It didn't last long at all to fully implement the full scope of its policies. And again, I ask, where would we be today if the Schechter brothers didn't have that perseverance to call out the president for overstepping his constitutional boundaries? The sweeping interpretations of the ruling had a lot of interpretations to legislative power and had devastating effects on President Roosevelt's New Deal program. And this is one of the reasons that FDR then attempted to pack the court. He wanted to increase the number of judges so that he would have jurists who would be inclined to uphold his policies. And that too failed in Congress. So I hope you see the value in what happened and how we can all thank the Schechter brothers for their perseverance. And thank you for joining me today. I will see you again real soon.